Hello, everyone, and welcome to Defrost the Chicken. My name is Natalie Calderon, and I'm going to be your host. All right, guys, so let's get started today. We are currently in the month of April, and it has been brought to my attention that it is C-Section Awareness Month. If you follow my Instagram page, then you might have seen some of my stories where I talked a little bit about this. Now, if you don't follow my Instagram page, please go and follow. I do give some updates on there as well. It's at Defrost the Chicken, and you'll see the little logo on there. I did talk a little bit about this, and I shared a reel that I've been seeing quite often. It was saying like April is C-Section Awareness Month. For those of you that think that C-sections are the easy way out, like I'm here to tell you it's not. This is what we go through. Something around those lines. I was just kind of like, who is going around telling people that getting a C-section is the easy way out? I didn't understand it because I've had two myself, and no one has ever said that to me. I've never came across someone who has said this out loud to me or just around me. Now, I did say that I don't think everything requires an awareness month. We have an awareness month for a lot of things these days, and I just necessarily don't think that everything needs an awareness month. However, April is C-Section Awareness Month. I do think that talking about C-sections is a great topic, being that this is a podcast about parenting and motherhood. This is something that comes with it. So let's talk about it. As I was doing some research, I did kind of begin to understand a little bit more, I guess, the misconceptions or the misunderstandings that are out there about C-sections. You better believe I ChatGPT'd this. So let's get started. All right, C-Section Awareness Month, typically recognized in April to educate, inform, and support people around all aspects of cesarean birth. Number one on the list is C-sections are common but misunderstood. In many countries, 1 in 3 births are by cesarean. Despite this, there's a lot of misinformation or judgment surrounding them. Some people view C-sections as the easy way out, in quotations, when in reality, it's major abdominal surgery with a long recovery. Number 2 is support and recovery awareness. Recovery from a C-section can be physically and emotionally tough, especially when it was unplanned. Awareness helps promote better postpartum care, support systems, and mental health understanding. Number 3, informed choices. Many parents aren't fully informed about when cesareans are necessary, what risks they carry, or what their rights are during birth. Awareness helps people make empowered, evidence-based decisions about their birth plans. Highlighted disparities. In some regions or demographics, C-sections are overused due to hospital policies, convenience, and liability fears. In others, they're underused, even when medically necessary because of lack of access to care. Right. The next one is destigmatizing birth experiences. Whether a C-section was planned, unplanned, or traumatic, people deserve recognition that every birth is valid, and no one should feel shame for how their child entered the world. So it says, in short, C-Section Awareness Month exists to educate, validate, and empower. It's not about promoting C-sections. It's about understanding them. I guess this could be useful for some people. Maybe I am assuming that all this information is common knowledge, but maybe it's not. I don't know. Well, with that being said, let's go into the history of cesareans, okay? And then I'm going to tell you guys my experience. Now, like I mentioned, I have had 2 C-sections, and I had 2 completely different experiences. My first C-section was easy, the best outcome that you could ask for, and the second one was completely different. Now, let's get into the history of a cesarean section, aka C-section. The first recorded cesarean section where both the mother and baby survived took place in Switzerland in the year 1500. According to legend, a swine gelder, I'm going to stop because if you're anything like me, you have no idea what a swine gelder is. Now, I had to look up the pronunciation because I wasn't sure if it was gelder or gelder. I've never heard this word before. According to YouTube, it's pronounced gelder. And what that is a person that castrates animals. So a swine gelder would be a person that castrates pigs, swine. Okay, so a swine gelder named Jacob Neufer performed the operation on his wife after a prolonged and difficult labor. With the help of several assistants, remarkably, she is said to have recovered fully and later gave birth to more children. However, C-sections have been mentioned in ancient texts, including from ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, and India. These were typically performed post-mortem or when the mother was not expected to survive childbirth. The procedure was originally intended to save the baby, not the mother. It wasn't until the 19th century, with the introduction of antiseptics and anesthesia, that C-sections began to be performed more safely and commonly on living women. Before C-sections became safe, prior to the late 19th century, the maternal mortality rate was extremely high, often exceeding 50%, and in some cases as high as 80 to 100%, depending on the setting and the time period. Now, I'm going to read off the reasons why it was so deadly. First reason was no antiseptics or sterile techniques. Infections were common and often fatal. The second reason was no anesthesia. With no anesthesia, you can just imagine the pain, which made it very difficult to perform this carefully and effectively. The third reason is hemorrhage. So blood loss was a major killer. And, back in the day, there were no transfusions. So people were not getting blood transfusions. That wasn't an option. The next reason is lack of surgical expertise. In many early C-sections, these things were done out of desperation, often by people without the formal surgical training. So those are the main 4 causes for death during C-section before it was safe and there was anesthesia and antiseptics involved. All right. That is a lot of information that I did not know, and it's actually interesting. I like to know the history of things. All right, so I'm going to start off by talking about my first C-section, and I had that one back in 2016 when I gave birth to my first daughter, and I did know pretty early on that I was going to need a C-section, and I was fine with it. It was the best thing for me medically and for the baby. So I was a little nervous, but it wasn't anything crazy. I am a planner and I like to know when things are happening, I think mainly because of my anxiety. So I think that kind of helped me because if I'm being completely honest, I was terrified to give vaginal birth. I had seen my sister give birth to her 2 daughters. I was there for both of them and I saw how much pain she was in. And I was like, oh my God, I never want to do that ever. So I was nervous, but I was okay. So when I found out that I needed a C-section, I was kind of like, well, now I know I don't need to do that. I was also nervous because I never had surgery up until that point. When they told me that I was going to need a C-section, I hadn't had surgery ever in my life. I was like, oh my God, this is going to be my first time having surgery. Ultimately, I was okay with it and I wasn't that nervous. Now, I think that by the time it came for me to have my daughter, I was a little bit more at ease just because I had to have surgery while I was pregnant. I actually had to have an appendectomy, and that's a removal of my appendix. I was probably about 19 weeks pregnant when I started having this pain on the side of my stomach, and I went to the doctor because I was like, I'm pregnant. I probably shouldn't be having these pains in my stomach. And they did an ultrasound and everything, and they told me that they couldn't find anything, that everything was fine, that it was probably my gallbladder because of the pregnancy or something like that. And they put me on a bland diet and sent me home. So a couple weeks went by and I'm on this diet and the pain is not going away. It didn't necessarily get worse. It did hurt a little bit more, but it wasn't anything crazy. It was just a nagging pain that was there, that wasn't excruciating. It wasn't limiting me from doing like a lot of things. I was still going to work. I was still like in a decent mood. I was still walking around. Like it was just kind of annoying more than anything. A couple weeks went by and the pain did get a little worse, but again, it wasn't that bad. So I think it was like a weekend and I told my husband, I said, I know they said it was just my gallbladder and it's not a big deal, but I just have a feeling that something is not right. So we go to the emergency room. In the waiting room, just waiting for them to call me back, I honestly felt a little silly because we were just hanging out, laughing, talking. I had the pain there, but it wasn't something that was keeping me from still being able to laugh and talk and enjoy conversations and stuff. And I looked around and there was people there that looked sick and I almost felt like, what am I doing here? I'm just like wasting resources. I feel pretty good. Maybe I should have just waited till Monday and went to my doctor. Well, they took me back and then they told me like, hey, your appendix is about to burst. You need to have emergency surgery like right now. And that was scary because I was like, what? I've never had surgery before and I'm 19 weeks pregnant and now I'm going to have my appendix removed. So that happened. After I woke up from surgery, I was in a lot of pain in my abdominal area. I was super sore. Everything turned out okay, obviously. I didn't have any complications. I think they told me there was like a 20% chance that I could lose the baby during the surgery. The doctor that did the surgery on me came in, talked to me, told me all the risks. And then, he reassured me that he had done these a lot of times and everything was going to turn out okay, that I shouldn't worry. So I was nervous, but ultimately, there was nothing I could really do. It was either have the surgery or not have the surgery, and my baby probably would have died and me. So we went in, we did the surgery, and the recovery from the appendectomy was honestly more painful than my recovery from my C-section. So anyways, we're going to move back to the C-section. But I was a little less nervous because I'm like, well, I already had surgery before. Like, we made it this far. And the surgery started, I was kind of shaking a lot. And I asked the anesthesiologist, like, is this normal? Why am I shaking? He's like, yeah, you're cold and it's the medication. And I said, okay. My baby came out. I heard her crying. I got to see her within a couple of minutes. And they closed me up. And then they took me out of the room. Once they took me out of the operating room, I started to vomit for a while. It seems like I had an allergic reaction to one of the medications, but they ended up giving me Benadryl and then the vomiting stopped. And that was honestly the worst thing that happened during my first C-section. After that, I went to the recovery room and everything was just smooth sailing from there. I had very minimal pain. I remember that same day I was sitting up in the bed Indian style with my legs crossed, and the nurse came in and she was like, oh my God, like, why are you sitting like that? What, like, stop that. And I was like, what happened? She's like, you just had a major surgery. I was like, oh, okay. And she's like, that doesn't hurt. And I said, no, I feel fine. Like, I'm not in pain. She said, really? I said, yeah. It's okay. Well, she's like, let's just get you out of that position just to be on the safe side. We don't want to irritate the scar. It could open up, all these things. I said, okay. They actually let me go home a day early because I did so well. And I think they only gave me Tylenol while I was there. And then when I left the hospital, I think I only had Tylenol also for pain. I didn't need any strong meds. I was moving around pretty well. Everything just went super smooth. My incision healed very well and quickly. I really had no complaints, and I thought, wow, this was so easy and damn near painless. I was a little nervous also to have a C-section because I had been told a lot of horrible stories from moms that I knew, like, oh my God, the pain after a C-section is horrible. You're going to feel like a truck hit you. I felt like my guts were going to come out. Like, I heard all these things and I was like, what the heck? I did very well. So that was cool. Life went on. Now we're going to fast forward 8 years later. I ended up getting pregnant with my second daughter, which honestly, I never thought that I would see the day after I had my first daughter. And I have mentioned this before in other episodes. I did struggle with postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety. And that was very scary for me. And I said I never wanted to have any more kids just because I never wanted to go through that again. As the years went by and I got older also, I was like, man, do I really not want another baby because I'm getting older and I got to make that decision now. So I was terrified. I felt like I was missing something. I decided to have another baby. When I finally got pregnant, I was like, oh my God, like this is happening. And I was so excited. Honestly, I was in a different place in my life than I was when I had my daughter. I was able to stay home and not work and just focus on my mental health and my physical health. And I felt like this time things were going to be a lot less stressful. And maybe I wouldn't have to go through the postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety. And, I just had these ideas in my head about how great everything was going to be. My pregnancy went pretty good. I did decide very early on that I wanted to have a vaginal birth this time around. Now, there was no reason why I couldn't. I didn't have the same issue that I had the first time around. The doctor did suggest that I have another C-section just because I had a C-section the first time, that it would be easier. She plugged in some numbers in the computer and said that the computer said that I had a 52% chance of being able to have a vaginal birth. And I was just kind of like, well, that's just a computer. I know so many moms that had to have a C-section the first time around and then were able to have a vaginal birth after. So I was like, well, that's what I want to do. Like at that point in my life, I felt like I wanted to experience going into labor. I felt like I was missing out on that experience. And I was pushing for that. And the doctor was pushing for me to get a C-section, but she didn't really have a reason. Like there wasn't like this is medically necessary. It was just like, well, the chances are that you won't be able to do it just because you didn't do it the first time. But the first time I didn't even try. It was scheduled. I never went into labor. I never had one contraction. So in my head, I'm like, this lady doesn't know what she's talking about. Like she just wants me to get a C-section just because it's easier for everyone. But that's not what I want. So I stuck to my guns and I did everything I could to make sure that I would have a semi-easy labor. I stayed active my whole pregnancy. I weight trained my whole pregnancy up until 36 or 38 weeks. I can't remember anymore. The time came. My due dates came and went, and the baby was still in there. I wasn't dilating. So after 2 weeks, we decided to do an induction. And the day of the induction came. That morning, I woke up and I lost part of my mucus plug. Me not knowing how going into labor works, I was having contractions and I lost the mucus plug. I was like, okay, so I'm going to go into labor now so I don't need the induction because things are going to move rapidly. So I thought. So I called the hospital and I was like, hey, I'm scheduled for an induction this afternoon, but I just lost my mucus plug and I'm having contractions. So do I still need to go in and get induced or do we have to cancel that? What do we do? The lady at the hospital was like, your contractions are still pretty far apart. Let's not cancel your induction. I said, okay. So she goes on the computer and she looks and it turns out that I wasn't scheduled for the induction. And I told her like, I have the email right here. It says that I'm scheduled to come in today at this time to start my induction. And she's like, well, I'm sorry. It looks like somebody made a mistake. They didn't actually schedule you. She goes, actually, if you want to come in right now, we can just start everything. And I was like, okay. Now that I look back, that was probably the first sign that things were not going to go as expected. I go in for the induction and, we get started fairly quickly. What they end up doing is they insert this balloon and it's not inflated. And then once it's in, they inflate it and it helps you dilate. And once you're dilated to 3 centimeters, it falls out on its own. We had to do that twice. The first time around was extremely painful. I wasn't dilated enough to even try that. They attempted it. Second time around, we tried. I was already on epidural, and I think they gave me something else for the pain. And that was a lot easier. They were able to get it in. So by the time it fell out, I was like, cool, we're progressing. Like things are moving along. I still had a ways to go, but honestly, my dilation was moving very slowly. And because I had a C-section previously, there was one medication that they couldn't give me that they usually give when you get an induction. The probability of dilating to where I needed to be was not very high to begin with, but it wasn't impossible. So I gave it a shot. I ended up getting stuck at 6.5 centimeters for a very long time. 24 hours had came and gone, and I'm still at 6 centimeters. The doctor did come in the room and tell me that we weren't making any progress and that she thinks that I should just get a C-section. Also, I forgot to mention that I spiked a fever throughout all of this, which was probably the second sign that things were not going to go well. But the nurses and the doctor assured me that it was normal, that I had been in labor for quite some time now, that happens sometimes. They got my fever down and time went on. When the doctor came in and told me that I probably needed to get a C-section, I'm not going to lie, I was disappointed that I couldn't dilate and I couldn't give vaginal birth like I wanted. When she asked me if I wanted to have the C-section or if I wanted to wait a little longer, I looked at my husband and he's just like, we're going to do whatever you want to do. Like, if you want to wait, let's wait. The doctor said, well, let me look at everything here. So she's looking at my chart, at the baby's heart rate and everything. And she goes, there's no harm in waiting a couple more hours. If you want to wait until you're absolutely sure if this is what you want to do, we can wait a couple more hours if you move along. And if you don't, we'll just get the C-section. And I said, okay. My husband said, yeah, well, let's do that. That way you feel good about the choice. While I'm having this conversation with the doctor, my husband, there's this little nagging voice that I hear that's just telling me to just get the C-section, just get the C-section. And doctor's telling me everything's fine. There's no harm in waiting. But there's this little voice that's there telling me, Natalie, just get the C-section. Stop fucking around and get the C-section. And I'm trying to ignore it because I didn't want to have the C-section. I wanted to try and push this baby out. But it's just like, stop. Just do it now. And the doctor's walking out of the room and I stop her. I said, hey, you know what? Let's just do the C-section. She tells me, are you sure? And I said, no, I'm not, but let's just do it. And she said, well, I want you to be okay with your choice. If you're not sure, we can wait. It's okay. There's no harm in waiting. And I said, no, let's just do it. She's like, I want you to be okay with your decision. And I said, I'm never going to be sure. Let's just do it before I change my mind. Because everything in me wanted to change my mind and just tell her that I wanted to wait. But there was just something there telling me not to. So she said, okay. Within a few minutes, we're in the operating room. We're getting ready to start. The nurses take me in. They tell my husband, like, we're going to take her in first and then we'll bring you in. So it's just me and the nurses and the doctors at this point. And we enter the operating room and I'm nervous. I'm shaking. I'm scared. I'm crying at this point. And the nurses were so nice and so sweet and so very reassuring. And one of the nurses is like, what's going on, sweetie? Like, why are you crying? And I told her, I'm scared. And she said, scared of what? And I said, I don't know. I'm just scared. And she said, there's nothing to be scared about. She's like, everything's going great and everything looks good. We're just going to get you all set up. We're going to get your baby out and you're going to have your baby girl here before you know it. And they're just all happy. It's 2 a.m. or 1:30 a.m. at this point. And they're just happy in the best mood and just being so reassuring. And I'm like, nah, there was something there with me that day, guiding me, protecting me. And I don't know what it was. Was it my mom? May she rest in peace, telling me what I needed to do? Was it God? Was it a guardian angel? I don't know. But there was something there that was bigger than me, that was bigger than the doctors, that was bigger than anything. There was a presence with me that I can't explain in words that was telling me what to do and was preparing me for what was to come. And I guess technically there was no reason for me to think that something was going to go wrong, considering that the doctor said everything looked good with the baby and everything looked good with me. Everything was going as planned. But everything wasn't going as planned, right? And I didn't see that until after. Well, one of the nurses then says to me, what do you want to listen to? We'll put on some music for you, something that helps you relax. That way you feel better. Now, when anybody asks me what type of music I like and stuff, I always go blank because I like a variety of things. And that question always just kind of stumps me. So I never have an answer to that question. And of course, I'm nervous and I'm scared and I couldn't think of anything. So the first thing that I thought of was my husband, who when he's concentrating on work or he's, trying to sleep at night, sometimes he'll turn on Hans Zimmer. And for those of you that don't know who Hans Zimmer is, he's a composer and he composes the music for movies like Interstellar and Gladiator. So I want you guys, if you guys have seen those 2 movies, I want you guys to imagine all the music in both of those movies. So those are very intense movies that have very dramatic scenes. So they put on the music. So then they bring my husband in and he walks in and he looks around. He's like, is that Hans Zimmer? And I said, yeah. And he's like, why? And I'm like, I don't know. They asked me what I like to listen to help me relax. And I couldn't think of anything. So I said Hans Zimmer because you listen to that music. He would later tell me that when he walked in, he felt like he was in a movie, like this big dramatic scene, walking into an operating room and Hans Zimmer's on, another sign of what was yet to come. So they start the C-section. And, I'm feeling super anxious. I feel like I can't breathe and I'm trying to hold it together. I'm not really saying anything. I'm just trying to concentrate on my breathing. I feel like my throat was closing. I start getting the shivers again and I'm shivering, shaking. And I'm just thinking to myself, my my God, just breathe through it, Natalie. It'll be over before you know it, because that's what happened the first time around. And when you're getting a C-section, they lay you down and they spread your arms wide open and they strap your arms down. So you can't move your arms. You're just kind of laying there with no control. You have no control of anything. You can't feel the bottom half of your body and you can't move the top half that you can feel, right? So I start swaying side to side. The operating table is like moving and they're jerking me around and I'm just like, what the hell's happening? I'm kind of like, is everything okay? And they're like, yeah, everything's fine. I'm like, oh, okay, whatever. Then I start hearing the doctors grunt. They're like grunting, like trying to pull something out that's stuck. And I'm like, what the fuck is happening? So then at one point I see one of the doctors, she's standing up because now I can see her past that sheet that covers you. I can see her head and she's like pulling and she's grunting. And I say, is everything okay? Like, what's going on? They're like, oh, yes, everything's fine. Baby just needs a little help. She's kind of wedged in there. And I was like, okay, maybe everything's okay. And then I hear the doctor say, pass the forceps. And I'm like, the forceps? Like, why do they need forceps? Like, none of this happened the first time around. So I don't know how much time went by, to be honest with you guys, because obviously I was scared and in shock and it's been 9 months. But they take her out. And I don't hear anything. I don't hear her crying. And I knew something was wrong. The nurses are kind of like scrambling. And I said, what's going on? And I told my husband, I said, she's not breathing because she's not crying. I don't hear her crying, so she's not breathing. And he asks, is the baby breathing? And I just, before they can answer, I said, no, she's not breathing. She's not crying. I said, go find out what's going on. And so the nurses are like, oh, the baby's just having a little bit of trouble. We just kind of have to help her breathe a little bit. So they're definitely like downplaying everything. And I know it's their job to try and keep you calm. But I knew that something was wrong. Then my story could be a little off because I was in shock. But they then tell me like, we need to take the baby to help her breathe I don't even know what they said. Do you want your husband to stay here with you? And then before she can even say or go with the baby, I just interrupted her and I told my husband, just go with the baby. Just leave me and go with the baby. And he said, okay. So everyone leaves. Well, not everyone, but a lot of them leave. And then there's just, the doctor, a few nurses left in the room. And I'm just laying there, helpless, with my arms spread open, strapped down to a table, cut open, without my baby, without my husband. And I'm trying to figure out what happened and if my baby is even alive. I had no idea what was happening. And I sat there for a minute and I was like, holy shit, am I going to even be okay? What is even happening right now? Because I'm not sure how much time went by. And it had been 8 years since I had a C-section. But from what I did remember, I felt like it was taking them a lot longer to close me up than it did the first time around. So I was like, am I even going to be okay? Like, is something wrong? Like, am I hemorrhaging? Like, what is happening right now? I asked the doctor and I said, am I going to be okay? And she goes, yes, you're going to be fine. It's just that we had to make the incision bigger to get the baby out. So it's just taking a little longer to close you up. And I said, okay, but I'm going to be fine. She said, yes. I said, is my baby going to be okay? And I think she said, that's what they're working on right now. They're going to do everything they can or something. And then I was like, what the fuck? It went from that morning or the day before, me being so excited that I was going into labor and having my baby, to this. So I was in complete shock and I didn't really know what to think. I didn't know anything. I couldn't move. And after a lot of this happened, I was able to process. One thing that I forgot to mention was, so I'm laying there waiting for them to close me up. And the doctor tells me, you made the right choice. If we would have waited, there would have been a different outcome. Now, at this point, I still didn't know what had happened or what went wrong. But when she told me that, I was like, man, that little voice was right. That little voice that told me to not wait and just get the C-section, despite what the nurses and the doctor said, that it was fine to wait, that everything looked great. That little voice was just nagging at me. And I don't know, you can believe whatever you want to believe, But what I believe is that there was something there with me that day that was bigger than me and bigger than anyone in that room, that guided me into making the right decision that eventually ended up saving my daughter's life. After they got me closed up, they took me to recovery. That was a completely different experience from the first time around. I was in so much pain. I felt like I had been run over by a truck. Not only that, I was just in shock. I just wanted to see my baby. I went back to an empty hospital room without my baby, without my husband. So my dad actually flew out to California in hopes that I would go into labor while he was there. And I did. And I had told my dad to go home, that I would call him when the baby was born. He had been there all day long. Now, my baby was born at 2 a.m. So my dad ended up leaving the hospital like around 10 p.m., I think, the night before. I was like, Dad, go get some sleep. I'll call you when the baby's here. Just go sleep. He's like, okay. As I'm sitting there by myself, I was able to get my phone and I text my husband like, hey, I'm in the recovery room now. Like, what's going on? Wow. Okay. I remember that he sent me a video and a few pictures of the baby. They were connecting her to an intubator and her little body was just shaking. And I didn't even know what was going on. I'm like, is she alive? What happened? Is this my fault? I just didn't know anything. He's giving me the information as he's getting it. The video that he sent me, it was just him standing behind a bunch of doctors and nurses while they worked on her. So he only knew little bits and pieces of what was happening. And so that's what he was telling me. And I'm just sitting there like, where is she right now? Like, where in this hospital is she? And why am I here? Later on, I would find out that the doctor said that she went without oxygen for at least 10 minutes. And she also had a punctured lung. Turns out that my pelvis was not big enough for her to fit through and she got stuck, which is why I wasn't dilating. She did weigh 9 pounds, 8 ounces. So she was a pretty big baby. While I'm sitting there waiting for my husband to give me more information, I said, oh shit, I should probably call my dad. At this point, it's probably like 4:30 in the morning. The sun wasn't out yet. So I called my dad and he was sleeping. He answers all half asleep. And I was like, hey, Dad. He's like, oh, is the baby here? Is the baby here? And I said, yeah, she's here. Is she okay? And I stood quiet for a little bit because I'm like, how do I answer that question? And I said, well, and then my dad interrupted me and he goes, did she die? Like in a panic. He asked me this in Spanish. And I said, no. But, and then I paused again because I was realizing that I hadn't said any of this stuff out loud and I didn't know what to say. I didn't even really know what the hell was going on. So I said, no, but she wasn't breathing and Omar's with her and they had to intubate her. And he said, what happened? And I said, I don't know. I don't really know, Dad. I don't know what happened. If she's not breathing and they're going to transport her to another hospital that specializes in NICU care. He said, okay, I'm on my way. My dad was there, I don't know, within an hour at the hospital. And my husband stayed with the baby the whole time. So my dad stayed with me until I was transported to the other hospital where my daughter was. But for months after I had my daughter, I would replay that conversation with my dad in my head over and over. And I didn't want to think about it, but I couldn't help it. It would just, that conversation when I called him and he asked me if she died, when he asked me that, I think it's when I really realized that was a big possibility, that she could have died. I could literally be calling my dad and telling him that my baby had died instead of telling him, well, no, she's alive. She's intubated, but she's alive. I had no idea if she was going to make it. I had no idea what exactly was wrong. I just knew she was still technically alive. And I would be like, why can I get this conversation out of my head? I was processing everything that had happened. And I think I was in so much shock initially that I didn't have time to process everything. But I haven't thought about that conversation until now, actually. That feeling of having your baby and then not being able to see them and hold them, knowing that they're in danger, knowing that they could potentially die or have some sort of lifelong disability or disorder or something because of this traumatic birth is crazy. It's a feeling that I can't even explain. I spent what felt like an eternity not really knowing what happened to my baby, but in all reality, it wasn't really that long, a few hours maybe. When we got to the other hospital, a few hours later, I don't really even know what time it was. I want to say it was afternoon. So I gave birth to her at 2 a.m. and I don't think I was able to see her until maybe 3 p.m. I don't know. Time didn't make sense at that time. I could see her, but I couldn't hold her. I couldn't touch her. And I saw her just hooked up to a bunch of wires. The doctors told us that because she had gone at least 10 minutes without oxygen, that the chances of her having brain damage were kind of high. And they immediately started a cooling treatment. And what happens is they cool your body temperature down to reduce the chances of brain damage. And they have to do the treatment for 3 days. There might be more to that. Again, the information is kind of blurry just because I was in shock. But basically, that's what it was. So for those 3 days, she was just there on this treatment. And this required her to have these little pins in her head. So they needed to have her sedated because they couldn't have her moving because of these pins. And when I went to see her and she was trying to open her eyes, and I said, well, hold on. I said, I thought she was supposed to be sedated. Is she not sedated? And the nurse said, yes, we actually have to up the medication, or I can't remember the words exactly that she used, but they had to give her more medication to sedate her because she was fighting through the sedation. And I just remember thinking like, man, she's strong. My little girl, like she's fighting, and I just remember thinking like, I hope that she continues to fight because I can't lose her. And maybe saying that or thinking that, I guess, is selfish of me because I just felt that I wouldn't be able to survive losing her. And I know that we are a lot more resilient than we think. In my head, I said, if anything happens to her, I won't survive this. I won't be the same person that I was. And my other kids need their mom. So, I mean, all these things were going on in my head. And I just sat there and I cried uncontrollably. And I cried. And I told my husband that I wanted to leave. Like I needed to go outside of the NICU because I was in a wheelchair. And I would be going in and out. I'd go up to my room. Then I would come downstairs. And I could only be in there for very short periods of time. And then I had to leave. It was really hard for me to be in the NICU. And I felt guilty because in my head, I was thinking, why don't I want to be in here? She's my daughter and she needs me. I should want to be right here next to her every single second of the day. But I didn't want to. I found it very hard to be there. I felt so helpless. Like literally, I couldn't touch her. I couldn't do anything. She really didn't need me. She needed the nurses and she needed the doctors and she needed these machines that are helping her stay alive. What was I going to do? I couldn't do anything. I would just cry and cry. It was just too emotionally overwhelming for me to just stare at her and look at her little chest go up and down with the tube in her mouth, her being sedated, and I couldn't handle it. So I would walk out and get my shit together and then I'd walk back in. Now, I also felt like complete shit from the C-section. I mean, the pain I was in was nothing like the first time around. And I just wanted to lay down. I also lost a lot of blood during the surgery that my iron was very low. So they had to give me some iron through IV. And then I'm still, 9 months later, I'm still on iron supplements because my iron is still low. I never had issues with low iron previously. So I'm still struggling with that. But I was just exhausted. I was tired. I was mentally and physically drained. And I was scared. And I also had 2 other kids that I had to try and be strong for because I didn't want them to see me crying. I didn't want them to see me hurting because that was going to hurt them. So I was trying to keep it together and stay happy and not cry in front of him. So it was a lot. It was a lot. Man, once my daughter finished the cooling treatment, I was able to kind of hold her. Not really. I had to just kind of stand over the NICU bed. She had to stay attached to everything. But that was the first time I was able to hold her, I think, on day 4. They ended up doing a CAT scan of her brain after the cooling treatment. And by that point, they had to release me from the hospital. So then there was that. The time came for me to leave the hospital. That was hard. There was a lot of crying involved because even though it was hard for me to be in the NICU with her sometimes, I would just go downstairs when I wanted to see her any time of the day, in the middle of the night, whenever. I could just go downstairs. And I wasn't going to be able to do that anymore. We live about a 40-minute drive away from the hospital, but my husband ended up getting an Airbnb and we were about 7 minutes away. So we were a lot closer. But even then, it's like, what if something happens to her and I'm not there? So that was very hard for me. And I did a lot of crying, a lot of crying. I was in this very weird place, not only mentally, but physically. My physical recovery was brutal. I could barely move. It hurt so much to move. And I was not expecting that because in my head, my recovery was probably going to be the same as the first C-section. Easy peasy. And it was not. I was on painkillers and I started noticing after a while that I was having a lot of cold sweats. I was sweating through the sheets constantly. And I had my daughter in the middle of summer. And outside was about 105, 106 degrees. And in the Airbnb that we got, it was actually like a little studio. And they just had like this portable AC unit. And it just wasn't strong enough. It was really kind of stuffy in there. And my husband was like, oh my God, it's so hot in here. And I'm shivering. I was shivering from how cold I was. And I would go outside and sit in front of the sun to try and warm up. And I was still shivering. And he was like, it's really hot outside. You need to come inside. I'm like, I'm really cold that my bones hurt. And so that happened for a couple days. And then I would sweat profusely at night, just buckets of sweat. It was horrible. And on top of that, I'm over here just trying to survive physically, that I also didn't have the energy to get up and go to the hospital. But I would make myself do it because I'm like, I have to go see my baby. And there's a couple of pictures of me at that time, and I just look so pale and gray. It was horrible. It was horrible. My sister ended up flying out a couple days after I got released from the hospital, and she basically nursed me back to health. I got off of the oxy because I started to notice that I would start getting cold sweats and stuff once it started to wear off. And I was like, am I developing an addiction? Now, I have no idea if that's how it even works, but I just took myself off of the painkillers because I was like, the last thing I need is to now get addicted to freaking pain medication. I got off of those. My sister started cooking me soups, lentils that are high in iron, like a bunch of stuff. And I just felt like crap. I barely wanted to eat, but I started off by drinking broth with vegetables. And little by little, I started to eat a little bit more until I started to feel better. But that started to give me more physical strength. And I felt a lot better to go to the hospital and go see the baby. Once the doctors got the results from the CAT scan, they called us. And I remember that moment because we were at the Airbnb and my phone rings and I told my husband, I was like, the hospital's calling me. So I almost didn't want to answer. I was like, I don't know what they're going to say. And I was scared, but we answered it. And my husband was so confident. He's like, she's fine. They're going to tell us that she's fine. I know she is. And I will say this. My husband was my strength through everything. I don't know where he finds all this positivity and optimism, but he finds it every time. And he honestly saved me from myself because I catastrophize everything as it is. And don't put me in a traumatic situation because, let me tell you, I'm going to think worst case scenario. What if this happens? What if that happens? Well, she says right now, we went through everything and there is no signs of brain damage. She said, however, there is no way of actually knowing if she's going to have any developmental issues due to the lack of oxygen until she starts to get a little older and develop. We have to kind of keep an eye on her and see how that goes. So we said, okay. So she looks fine. It's like, she looks fine as of now. There's no signs of brain damage. We're like, oh my God, yes. She slowly started to get better. They were able to take her off of the ventilator. She just had the feeding tube. The one thing that I was doing while I was in the Airbnb was I was pumping. I felt like that was the only thing I can do. That the best thing for her was for me to give her breast milk. If I could make breast milk, then I was going to do everything in my power to give her all the milk that I could give her, because that was literally all I can do. And I pumped so much that my nipples started bleeding. My nipples were raw. I was pumping. I would just go and drop off all the milk at the hospital. But she started to eat really well. And they said if she continues to eat like this, then she can go home sooner than expected. They had originally told us that she was going to be in the NICU from 3 to 5 weeks. And that felt like an eternity for me. She was eating very well. And then they said, okay, now we're going to take her off the feeding tube and we're going to try feeding her with a bottle. And we're going to see how she does with the bottle and if she's eating the amounts that she's supposed to be eating. So sure enough, right away, my baby was eating her milk. She had no trouble eating from a bottle. They were able to release her after 9 days because she did so well. One of the nurses that was taking care of her said that in the 30 years or something like that she had been a nurse, she had never seen a baby that was born with the issues that my daughter had recover so quick and be sent home. So that made me very hopeful for the future. That and the fact that there was no signs of brain damage in the CAT scan. So my daughter is now 9 months old and she is developmentally doing very well. If anything, I think she's a little advanced. And she's like the happiest, most beautiful baby ever. Said every mom, right? But there is one last thing that I want to talk about, and that is the guilt that I had. I carried so much guilt for a few months until I came to terms with it and I was able to process it. But I felt guilty. I felt like everything that happened was my fault because I was being stubborn, because I wanted to have a vaginal birth, even though the doctor told me to have a C-section. And I carried that with me and I cried about that for a long time. I did ask the doctor at one point, I said, is this my fault? Could I have prevented this if I would have just gotten the C-section? His response to me was, could this have been prevented if you would have had a C-section from the beginning? He said, yes. Is it your fault? No. He said, there's no way for you to have known that your baby wasn't going to fit through your pelvis or your pelvic bone wasn't big enough or whatever it was. He said, the first time you had your daughter, you had a scheduled C-section. You didn't try to give birth. So there was no way for you to know or for the doctors to know that your pelvic area was not big enough to birth the baby. So were you wrong for trying to have a vaginal birth? He said, no, absolutely not. This is just something that happened. It was unfortunate. He said, that did make me feel better at that moment, but I still struggled with that guilt. I felt like the doctor kept pushing for me to get a C-section for a reason, and I was too stubborn to listen to her. And I kind of carried that with me for a while. And then I realized that that's just the way things had to be. A lot of things have changed since I had my daughter. Before all of this happened, as far as my faith goes, I didn't have a relationship with God, and I hadn't had one for a long time. I grew up Catholic, but I've always struggled with my faith. It's the whole believing in something you can't see that I've always struggled with. And I used to have so many conversations about this with my mom up until she died. When she died, all those conversations stopped and I stopped trying to figure it out. And I felt like not believing in God was easier than trying to figure out how it worked. You know, that's basically how things were. And after experiencing everything that I experienced, And after feeling that presence with me that I can't really explain, I think I started to change. And I think the way I looked at God and my faith started to change. Everyone believes in something different. But I know that there was something there with me that day. I just know it. I felt it. There were too many little things that happened, too many feelings of something bigger than me that I felt. After I got released from the hospital, I was just going through it emotionally. The crying, the nonstop crying was a lot. And I would just cry and I would just pray. And I wasn't sure what I was praying to, honestly. I wasn't even sure if I believed in God. I was confused about everything. And I was just like, I don't know. I don't know how to do this. I don't know what I'm doing. I feel like a hypocrite, but I'm just going to pray. And in those moments, that's the only thing that brought me comfort. I would ask my mom, may she rest in peace, to please protect my baby, to help me, to give me strength, because I didn't think I had any left in me. And once I came home with my baby and life started, I started to work on restoring my faith in God. And that's what I've been doing these last 9 months. And it's been an interesting journey. There's still a lot of things that I don't understand. There's still a lot of things that I'm learning. But in the middle of all this darkness that I've been through, and the postpartum anxiety and the postpartum depression that I got this time around as well, I've been turning to God to help me through it. And it hasn't been easy, but it has helped. So that's where I'm at today with everything. And that is my story of my 2 very different C-sections. I don't know if anyone can relate to any of this. I'm sure somebody out there can. Well, friends, that concludes our episode for today. And per usual, I'm going to go ahead and close this out with a quote. And I found one online that I found very fitting for the topic today. So here it goes. We've been told our bodies were made to do this, that they were designed to have babies, and all we have to do is trust them. So we did. And in return, we got trauma. I hope that you guys have an amazing rest of your week. I just want to give you guys a little bit of information. For those of you that don't follow my Instagram page, I did mention on there that I'm going to be sticking to a schedule. So the next episode is going to be released on May 2nd. That's a Friday, and it's going to be bi-weekly from now on. It's just the best thing for the podcast to stick to a schedule. So this next episode is going to be about divorce. I sit down with a friend of mine who's going to tell us her story and why she felt that divorce was the best thing for her and her daughter. So I'm super excited about this one. I think it's going to be a good episode. So please stay tuned. Follow us on Instagram if you don't follow. Follow Apple Podcast or wherever you listen. Please go ahead and hit that follow button so you can get the notifications when the new episode comes out. All right, everybody. Happy parenting.